Good morning. I am privileged to be invited by Torah Mitzion, the women's Beit Midrash, to speak to you this morning, and I'm very grateful that KTM has agreed to allow us to enlarge this session to make it available to whoever wants to join in commemoration of Yom Hashoah. Of course, that was yesterday. But I'd like to share some insights today that hopefully will not only deepen our understanding of the Holocaust and its impact even today, but specifically to share messages that hopefully are relevant and helpful that we can use to navigate the unique challenges that we are facing today. So I want to start with Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe, our greatest leader, witnessed firsthand the strength and might of God, punishing the Egyptians, splitting the Red Sea, protecting the Jews in the desert. And at the end of 40 years in the desert, Moshe said about God, Ki Hashem Elokeichem, because God, your God, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. He is a merciful God who is great and heroic and courageous. And we use those words of Moshe every time we pray in our Amidah. We begin the Amidah by describing God the way Moshe described him, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. About 800 years later, the prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, saw God's house destroyed, the destruction of the first temple. He saw the Jewish people murdered and persecuted and exiled, and he asked, where is God's courage? Where is God's heroism? How can I continue to pray those words about God when they don't match my experience of God? And about 100 years after that, our sages, known as the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, the men of the Great Assembly, a Sanhedrin, a Jewish court, they provided an answer. And they said that God's might and heroism are evident in the fact that God restrained himself and allowed evildoers to act. God has the self-discipline to show patience and to be slow to anger to those who spurn him. And they quoted another verse, another famous verse from Shir Hashirim, which we also say in our davening every day. And the pasuk is, Mi kamocha be'elim Hashem. Who is like God among the powerful? God is so powerful. Who else is as powerful as God? And our sages of the Anshe Knesset Hagdola interpreted the word, by seeming to change it slightly. And instead of reading it, Mi kamocha be'elim Hashem, who is like God among the strong, heroic ones, they interpreted it as if it said, Mi kamocha be'ilmim, who is like God among the silent ones? Who is like God among the quiet and hidden ones? And so what our sages actually did, they redefined heroism and valor and strength. These concepts have more than one meaning. And in order to keep one's sanity in a changing world, we must be able to redefine traits, to look elsewhere for traits we know to be present. Just like that happens with God, the same thing happens with us. And it is nowhere more evident than during the Holocaust. We find among Jews who suffered that hell many distinct definitions of heroism and courage. All who experienced the Holocaust are heroes, but in many different ways. And I want to remember with you today one type of hero. But I want to make it clear that it's only one type. It is not to suggest that the other types are any less valuable. For example, Jews who escaped, Jews who fought back, Jews who survived, Jews who died with dignity. All of these and more are different types of heroes, and they express different forms of courage. But I want to remember with you now another definition, another form of courage. Now, I've shared with some of you before, one of the greatest personalities who went through the Holocaust and survived was the Blizhever Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael Spira. And there are many amazing stories told about him in an incredible book, Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust, written by Yafa Eliak. And I strongly urge, if you do not have that book, please get that book and please read that book, Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust by Yafa Eliak. It is incredible. So here's one story that she tells in that book. During the war, one year, on the first night of Hanukkah, Rabbi Yisrael Spira lit the menorah in a concentration camp, which itself was a miracle that they were able to gather the meager supplies necessary and to have the emotional energy to gather to light a Hanukkah menorah in a concentration camp. But they did. And he had the honor of lighting it. And he held up the candle and he made the first bracha. Asher kidushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah. We bless God that he commanded us in the mitzvah to light the Hanukkah menorah. And then he said the second bracha. She'asa nisim lavoseinu bayomim hahem bazman hazeh. We bless God that you performed miracles in the past for our people at this season of the year. And then he paused. And he looked around himself. And then he said the third bracha. Shehechiyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, God, that sustains us, keeps us alive, and allows us to come to this day. And then he lit the menorah. Later, a secular Jew came up to him and he said, Spira, I know you're a clever guy and I know you're an honest guy. I can understand your need to light the menorah even under these circumstances, even though I don't agree with it. But to light the menorah, to lift people's spirits. I can even understand you reciting the second blessing, which is a historical blessing to recognize that a miracle took place for the Jewish people many years ago in this season. I understand that. But how in the world could you say the third bracha? How in the world can you be in a concentration camp where there are hundreds of dead Jewish bodies all around you, when every person here is a walking skeleton? How can you possibly say these words that you're blessing God for sustaining you, for keeping you alive? For keeping you alive? This is called keeping you alive? How could you say that? And the rabbi said to him, you're absolutely right. And when I reached the third bracha, I also hesitated. And I asked myself if I should say it under these circumstances. And so I turned around in order to ask one of the other rabbis present their opinion to see what I should do. But as I turned around, I noticed that behind me, there was a crowd of living Jews. And they were listening to the brachos of lighting the Hanukkah menorah. And I said to myself, if God has such a nation that at times like these, when during the lighting of the menorah, they see in front of them the bodies of their fathers and mothers who have been murdered, and their sons and daughters and sisters and brothers and husbands and wives, and they are living with death. And if in spite of that, they stand in a crowd with devotion, listening to the blessing, if I have been blessed to see such a people with such faith, then I am under a special obligation to recite the third blessing. Shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, God, that you have sustained me and kept me alive and enabled me to see this moment. So we must know. Those of us who were there must remember. Those of us who were not there must learn. And all of us must teach our children and grandchildren that there were many Jews during the Holocaust who, against all odds, retained their faith in God. The Klausenberger Rebbe, who experienced the worst of the concentration camps firsthand, said, quote, "The biggest miracle of all is that we, the survivors of the Holocaust, after all we have witnessed and lived through, still believe and have faith in God. This, my friends, is the miracle of miracles, the greatest miracle ever to have taken place." I will confess to you that I don't know how these heroes were able to do it. And I would never condemn or judge the many whose faith was destroyed. If anything, that makes more logical sense to me. But though I might not understand how, it is nevertheless true. For a great number, their faith did stand up and survive. And we today must recognize and admire and be proud of this miraculous, unique definition of courage and heroism, which is faith amidst terror. And when we face crises in our lives, we need to be inspired by them. One of the most dramatic and eloquent representatives of this type of heroism is a man with whom many of us know and are familiar with, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau. Rabbi Lau is the former chief rabbi, Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. Before that, he served in several other illustrious rabbinic positions in Israel. And early in his career, in 1978, he was 41 years old, and he applied for the position of chief rabbi of the city of Netanya in Israel. And he was young to be considered for that position. But he tells the story that he went to a meeting in Netanya with the mayor and some of the staff, some of the other local leaders, and they interviewed him, they asked him questions. The meeting lasted for 4 hours. And the entire time during the meeting, there was one man, an older man, white hair, who sat and didn't say a word for the entire meeting. Only when the meeting was over and everyone stood up to shake hands, to say goodbye, this man said, "Please permit me, before everyone leaves, to say just a few words. He said, during these last hours when we were sitting with Rabbi Lau, I was reliving the 11th of April, 1945. I had been deported from my hometown of Zarka, Poland, to Buchenwald concentration camp. On April 11, 1945, American airplanes circled the skies of the camp. The prisoners, and I was among them, burst out of the barracks, and we began running to the gate, anticipating our liberation after 6 years of suffering. And as we were running to the gate, shots were being fired at us. We had no idea who was shooting, from where, or why. We had no idea what was happening. We only knew that our lives were in danger. And as I was running to the gate, I saw, also running to the gate, a little boy. Later, I learned that his name was Lulik, and he was just under 8 years old. And I realized that any child running in Buchenwald had to be Jewish. So I jumped on top of him and threw this little boy to the ground, and I lay over him to protect him from the bullets. And today, he said, I see before me, alive and well, Rabbi Lau, that very same Lulik, the boy from Buchenwald. And then he finished and he said as follows. He said, now I declare to you, I, David Anilevich, that was his name. He was the deputy mayor of Netanya at the time, that I was saved from that horror. I fought in the Palmach, and I today serve as the deputy mayor of an Israeli city. If I have the merit of seeing this child, who I protected with my body, become my rabbi, then I say to you, there is a God. I want to shift it to a slightly different direction, a slightly different aspect of this. I've spoken with many of you about another amazing person, Rabbi Ephraim Ashri. Rabbi Ashri, and what I hope to add today is something that I believe I have not shared with anyone before today. But Rabbi Ashri was a rabbi, a scholar, a posek, an authority on Jewish law in the Kovna ghetto. And people would come to ask him questions on points of Jewish law. And they asked him all kinds of questions. They asked mundane questions like, are we allowed to build the sukkah in the ghetto if the only wood we have we stole from the Nazis? Ordinarily, to build a sukkah from stolen materials, the sukkah is invalid. What if we stole it from the Nazis? Okay, that's one question. Another question, other questions were life and death. Man came to him and said, my son is rounded up and he's going to be murdered in the morning, and I have the ability to get him out, but if I get him out, another boy will be put in his place and killed. Do I have the right to save my son if it means that another boy is going to be killed? And Rabbi Ashri had to answer these questions without time to think about it, without colleagues to consult, without a library or resources to look up these questions. And he made very brief notes on little scraps of paper of the questions and answers. He filled coffee cans with these notes. He buried the coffee cans. He survived the war. He came back and he dug up these coffee cans and he took the notes. He later became a rabbi in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York for the rest of his life. He passed away a number of years ago. And once he was in New York, he took the notes and he wrote a complete work with sources that he now had available. And he called it Shailus Utshuvas Mimamakim, responsa from the depths, the questions that he was asked, in order to record how even in the depths of the Holocaust, Jews wanted to know what Jewish law says in a given situation. What does God want from us, even under these circumstances? There is a one-volume, abridged version of this called Responsa from the Holocaust. Here too, I urge you, if you do not have this, please get this. It is an amazing volume, one volume, Responsa from the Holocaust by Rabbi Ephraim Ashri. One of the questions that he was asked is the proper wording for the blessing of martyrdom. And he describes the scene as follows. There was a day that all of the inhabitants of the ghetto, at that time 30,000 people, were gathered in the square. And it was clear that at least a significant number of them were going to be murdered at that moment. And Rabbi Ashri, standing in this crowd, awaiting death, he was approached by another Jew who said to him, "Please tell me, what is the correct wording of the bracha that I should say if I am murdered before my life expires?" Because, after all, it's a mitzvah of martyrdom, of Kiddush Hashem, of giving up our life simply for the fact that we are Jews. So it's kind of a technical question, because whenever we have a bracha concerning a mitzvah, there are two forms. Sometimes we would say the word al, sometimes we would say the word le. For example, before we wash our hands for Netilas Yadayim, we say al Netilas Yadayim. Before we listen to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, we make the bracha lishmoa kol shofar. So al Netilas Yadayim means we're blessing Hashem for sanctifying us and giving us the commandment concerning washing our hands. Al Netilas Yadayim means concerning washing our hands. But lishmoa kol shofar, blessed Hashem, who sanctified us and commanded us to hear the sound of the shofar. It's almost the same, but it's a slightly different phrase, and different mitzvos have a different formula for what the bracha should be. So the question, the technical question is, should the bracha that I recite in the moment before I am going to be murdered by the Nazis, should it be Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech olam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu, blessed are you God, who sanctified us with your commandments and sanctified us al kiddush Hashem, concerning sanctifying God's name? Or should it be lekadesh es Hashem, to sanctify God's name? So just think about this for a moment. I mean, what if this person, his name was Rabbi Eliyahu from Warsaw, that was the name of the man who asked the question. What if he said the wrong version? What if he said the wrong phrase? What if he didn't get it right? Does that mean that his act of martyrdom is any less valuable? Does that mean that he fulfilled the mitzvah to any lesser degree just because he got the phrase wrong? But Rabbi Eliyahu believed, and Rabbi Ashri, who received the question and gave an answer, which I'll share with you in a moment, believed it was important. Especially under these unbearable circumstances, it is important to practice the mitzvos correctly, with precision, the way they should be. Even, and I would say not even, but especially in the face of suffering and death. Rabbi Ashri wrote in his introduction to his work, even in the hour of murder and massacre, the Spirit of God continues to beat within Judaism. Even when she believes, even then, she believes in the true salvation of Israel. It's important to do it right. And so Rabbi Ashri answered the question in a classic halachic manner. He referred back, by memory, to an earlier source. Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz, known as the Shalah, lived in the 1500s. He was a great German Jewish halakhic authority, and the Shalah, in his work, had answered this question. And he says, the correct text of the bracha is, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech olam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu, likadesh es Hashem barabim. Blessed are you, God, who sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us in the mitzvah to sanctify his name in public. Likadesh es shmo barabim. And that was the correct text. Certainly our situation today is not comparable to the Holocaust. But I must tell you that it has been inspiring to me to hear the questions that people have been asking me under the difficulties that they face. How to be able to observe Pesach. How to be able to do a Seder if I'm all alone and I don't know what to do. Other kinds of questions that are applicable now. How do we go through Shiva during these times, God forbid? How do we have a bris? Do we have a bris? Question, very relevant question. And it's a very difficult question in Jewish law. What happens to deposits? Let's say I was scheduled to perform at a wedding and I received a deposit and now the wedding is canceled. Do I have to return the deposit? What about the expenses that I already spent to get ready for the event? Now it's not taking place. Jews, many Jews, not all Jews, but many Jews, want to do the right thing, want to do it correctly, because it matters. And as we go through what we are going through, this aspect of heroism must continue to inspire us. I want to share with you something. It's quite incredible. It's of a more personal nature. It's about my grandfather. So, I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. My grandfather was Sam Margolin. He passed away in 1995. I was very, very close with him. He was a very successful and respected business leader in Memphis. He was a Jewish leader. He was one of the founders and lifelong supporters of the Memphis Hebrew Academy, one of the earliest Hebrew academies in North America to open in the early 1950s. Later, that school was renamed the Margolin Hebrew Academy in his honor. And he was a very important personality, not only in my life, but in the life of the larger community. And what I'm going to share with you, I never knew about until years after he had passed away. And it's just remarkable. In 1989, there was a rabbi in Memphis. His name is Rabbi Mark Levine. I also know and think very highly of him, an older colleague. He was a rabbi not of the shul that my grandfather attended, but the rabbi of another shul. He did a PhD in history at Memphis State University, and his project was an oral history of Jewish leaders of the Memphis community and their response to the Holocaust. So I'm going to share with you part of this interview that he did with my grandfather. Now, in 1989, when the interview was done, my grandfather was well-to-do, renowned, revered, respected. Of course, in 1933, when the Nuremberg laws were enacted, so 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted. My grandfather was 25 years old. He was born in 1910, so he was a very young man. He was just starting out his career. He was quite poor. Certainly was no type of a leader or influential anything. But let me tell you some of the questions that Rabbi Levine asked my grandfather. In 1935, when the Nuremberg laws were enacted, do you remember hearing about that? He says, yes, I remember that. My grandfather said, yes, I remember it. Do you remember any community activity to boycott German products in response to those laws? That's something that did happen in other places. And so my grandfather said, well, I was a very young man. I don't actually remember any organized effort in that way. Do you remember as a member of the Baron Hirsch, that was the largest synagogue at that time to which my grandfather belonged, and our family always belonged to Baron Hirsch. It's still there in Memphis. But in that time, the early 1930s, do you remember the rabbi of the Baron Hirsch speaking out in his sermons about what was happening to Jews in Germany and Europe? And my grandfather said, I don't remember. If he did, maybe he did, but I don't remember. Again, he was a young man in his 20s, late 20s. Certainly was not prominent in any way. Then they asked, okay, what about the president of the Baron Hirsch congregation? At that time, the president of the Baron Hirsch congregation was a man whose name was Will Gerber. Now, Will Gerber, in addition to being a synagogue president, was also very politically influential. He was a right-hand man to Mr. E.H. Crump. Now, Mr. E.H. Crump, in the 20s and 30s in Memphis, was the mayor. He wasn't, but in those days, he wasn't just the mayor, he was the boss. He was the dictator. He was all-powerful. And Mayor Crump was a very close friend of President Roosevelt. Crump was a person who could call Roosevelt on the phone and say, "Can I come for dinner?" And Roosevelt would say, "Sure, come on over." That's the relationship they had, partially because Crump could deliver blocks of votes through various means to support Roosevelt, which he did. So you have Crump, mayor of Memphis, dictator of Memphis, who had access to Roosevelt. And you had Gerber, who was president of the synagogue, who was the right-hand man. So the question was, did any Jewish leaders, such as Will Gerber, go to Crump and say to him what's happening to Jews in Germany and Europe, and say to him, would you please go to Washington and sit down with Roosevelt and counter what we later learned were some of Roosevelt's advisors advised him to do nothing. There were some national Jewish advisors who tried to meet with Roosevelt to get him to be active on behalf of saving Jews, which he certainly could have done. But did the Jewish community use any of its effort or political influence to try to change the opinion of Roosevelt? And they had access. They had access through Crump. They had access through the senator from Tennessee at that time, who was from Memphis, Senator McKellar, who was chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. He had a great deal of power. There were prominent members of the Jewish community who had access to him. Did anybody go and speak to him and say, use your influence? And this is the question. There were a number of people in the Jewish community of Memphis in the 1930s and 40s who had access to some of these very important people. Did anyone think to try to use their influence to change the outcome? And my grandfather answered, I don't think they were aware of their power. I think they relied on national figures to carry the ball for them. And maybe national figures with national reputations, but the general attitude was, who was going to listen to somebody from a sleepy town on the banks of the Mississippi River? But then my grandfather added, there is no question that looking back on it, if we had understood our power, it might have had a much different turn of events. I never knew about this interview with my grandfather. And I was astounded to learn about it and to learn about his honesty in answering these questions. They must have been very, very painful questions for him. And certainly this is not to criticize in any way, but it is to understand and to internalize and to pledge not to stand by, not to rely on someone else. And a lesson that we have to take in our lives today and every day is that precise lesson. In the words of an amazing woman, Hetty Epstein, who was a Holocaust survivor and an activist who shared her story in schools and community events around the world. She passed away in 2016, and she would always end her talks with the following words: remember the past. Don't be a bystander. I want to share one more story, and then to conclude. This is a remarkable story. I've told this before. It's a story told by Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz is an interesting man. He is the founder of Starbucks. He's an Orthodox Jew. Very, very interesting person. And obviously, as you understand, in the United States, in America, he is one of the 1%, one of the highest paid, most successful CEOs of major corporations in America. And he tells the story that once he was in Israel with a group of 5 other CEOs like himself, all multi-billionaires, all highly successful in their careers, in their industries. And they took a trip to Israel, a very high-level trip, met with the prime minister and all of the dignitaries. And then they did something that was completely outside of their experience and completely outside of their comfort zone. The group, Howard is a modern Orthodox Jew. So the others are Jewish, some secular, some more religious, less religious, a varied group of these executives. They went to a meeting in Meir Sha'arim at the Mir Yeshiva, which is a bastion of the Haredi world, far outside of their experience or exposure, to have a meeting with the head of that yeshiva, Rabbi Nassan Tzvi Finkel. Now a blessed memory, he has since passed away. He was a great, great Torah leader, scholar, and teacher for decades. But someone that on the surface would have no connection, no connecting point to these 5 gentlemen, but kind of like an exotic experience. They had a meeting with him. So these 6 gentlemen went to Meir Sha'arim, went to the Mir Yeshiva, and they went into his study and they sat down to wait for him. And he finally came in. At that time, he was a very elderly man. He walked with great difficulty and slowly. He came in and he sat down and he said, "Gentlemen, I want you to look at me. I want to get right to the point because I know you're very, very busy people." Just a little dig at their self-importance. But he said, "I'm going to make this short." And then he said, "Who can tell me what is the lesson we should learn from the Holocaust?" And then he called on somebody. He says, "You, what's the lesson?" Now, these people were not used to being questioned in this way, and they certainly did not expect that they were going to be called upon in this meeting. So it was like he was back in 5th grade, this multi-billionaire. And we will never forget. The rabbi said to him, "You don't know what you're talking about." Now everybody else realizes he's going to call on them, so they're going to have to come up with an answer. So he calls on somebody else. And this other fellow says, "We will never again be a victim." Rabbi says, "You guys don't get it. You just don't know what you're talking about." He says, "Okay, listen to me just for 1 minute. And I'm going to tell you the essence of the human experience. I'm going to tell you the lesson of the Holocaust." And this is what he said. He said, "As you know, during the Holocaust, people were transported in the most terrible, inhumane way by rail car, and they thought they were going to a work camp. They didn't know they were going to a death camp. And after hours and hours of traveling under terrible circumstances, they would arrive in the middle of the night, and the doors would be open, and lights would be flashing, and dogs were barking at them. And they separated, families separated, people were separated from each other. And they went off to the bunkers to sleep. And as they went into the bunkers, one person was given a blanket for himself and 5 others. One blanket for 6 people. So when the person with the blanket went to bed, he had to decide, am I going to push the blanket to the 5 other people who did not get one? Or am I going to pull it to myself to keep myself warm? And Rabbi Finkel said, it was during this defining moment that we learned the power of the human spirit, because we pushed the blanket to 5 others. And then Rabbi Finkel stood up and he said to these men, take your blanket, take it back to America, and push it to 5 other people. So I want to say to you now, I want to say to you and to me now, take your blanket, whatever that is. Your blanket may be material or physical, it may be emotional, it may be spiritual. Whatever blanket it is that you have, take your blanket and push it to 5 other people. That is the lesson that we need to learn today from the Holocaust. Allow me to finish with this. This is perhaps, ironically, the most practical lesson for us to take from the Holocaust today. You may have read about this a few weeks ago. A great man passed away, William Helmreich. William Helmreich was a very well-known sociologist. His expertise was studying the Jewish community. He contracted the virus and he passed away tragically a few weeks ago. He was a great man, a great scholar. In 1992, he published a book titled Against All Odds, Holocaust Survivors and the Successful Lives They Made in America. And in order to create that book, he interviewed over 170 survivors. He reviewed thousands of pages of archive material in order to understand how it was that people whose lives had been destroyed and shattered and broken were somehow able to start over again in a new country, in a new life. And he found, through the interviews and through the archives, that they did this because these individuals had an exceptional capacity for hope. And he ends his book with the following quote. And I want to end my presentation to you with this quote. The story of the survivors is one of courage and strength, of people who are living proof of the indomitable will of human beings to survive and of their tremendous capacity for hope. It is not a story of a remarkable people. It is a story of just how remarkable people can be. Let that be our story today. Thank you very, very much.